Today's Pretty Deece is about Bitcoin. Just kidding. This week we're talking about Kamigawa block. I noticed a trend in the comments of the video for my blistering ode to Masks block. Lots of people asserting that Kamigawa block was actually the worst, and that is nuts to me. Was Kamigawa block perfect? No. I could tell you what was wrong with the sets, but I think context is going to help clear things up, so here we go. Mirrodin block preceded Kamigawa block, and Mirrodin block was busted. Just completely broken. First, standard was Onslaught block, 8th edition, and Mirrodin. That format was fine. The best decks were White Blue Control, Tooth and Nail, Goblin Bidding, and a fledgling version of Affinity that played Broodstar and Lodestone Mirror. It was cute, but also kind of terrible. Then Darksteel dropped, and with it came two important cards, Arcbound Ravager and Skull Clamp. Skull Clamp, an infamously undertested card, warped standard around it. Aaron Forsyth, a man quickly becoming a recurring character in this space, acknowledged this in his column announcing Skull Clamp's ban. Very rarely are cards banned so recently after they're printed. Darksteel was released February 2004, and Skull Clamp was banned effective the day of the release of the very next set, Fifth Dawn. Skull Clamp marked the first ban in Standard since Saga Block became legal, but we weren't done yet. Fifth Dawn came out in June 2004, and while it didn't add much to Affinity in terms of volume, it did contribute one dangerous card, Cranial Plating. After Cranial Plating hit, there was no reason to do anything other than play Affinity. It was in this environment that Champions of Kamigawa, a set that looked like Portal 3 Kingdoms and played like Legends, forced Onslaught block out of Standard. Unlike Onslaught block, Champions of Kamigawa was pretty powered down. For starters, all of the rare creatures were legendary, which necessitated a mild reboot of the legendary rules. Used to be that if a legendary permanent was on the battlefield, if another copy of that same permanent was put on the battlefield, the newest copy was immediately sacrificed as part of state-based effects. Effectively, it meant that if you didn't play the legend first, you were screwed. This rule sucked. Masks block constructed, for example, was all about Lyn Civi, Defiant Hero, meaning that the player that got to use their copies of Lyn Civi was mostly determined by the die roll. Gaia's Cradle and Tolarian Academy, both important cards in their day, were also subject to this bizarre rule. That was the worst. With the release of Champions of Kamigawa, Legends offed each other. If my opponent had a Moloku, I could cast my Moloku and they'd both go to the graveyard as a state-based effect. This rule was changed again for Magic 2014, but it held strong for almost 10 years. However, a revised Legend rule in a truly awesome limited format didn't change the fact that Champions of Kamigawa, with all of its fiddly expensive legends and spells with additional card types, didn't impact Standard in the slightest. Affinity was still the best thing. Sure, Tooth and Nail got Kiki-Jiki Mirror Breaker, Kodama's Reach, and Sensei's Divining Top, but trust me, I desperately tried to make Tooth and Nail work, and it was no match for Affinity. Professional play was weird at this point. The corresponding Pro Tour for Champions of Kamigawa was extended, which if you don't know is kind of like Modern before Modern existed. The Betrayers of Kamigawa Pro Tour was block constructed, and the Saviors of Kamigawa Pro Tour was draft. That's right, they used to have Pro Tours where people just drafted a bunch. My point is that professional players never really had to reckon with Standard at all after Champions of Kamigawa, but the broader player base did, every week at FNM or every weekend at Pro Tour qualifiers. I count myself among that broader base because JSS qualifiers were all Standard, and those were what I played in at the time. Like, look at this slate of GPs. Look at it! Not one single Standard Grand Prix with any Kamigawa block cards in an entire year. Not one! Sometimes I do these videos and I see stuff like this and I wonder how Magic used to be like this. Like, how deliberate was the choice to not have any Standard GPs for a year? Because it's definitely a choice, right? That is nuts. Though, it was easy to see why Wizards of the Coast didn't want to showcase Standard at that point. Affinity was the kind of dumb deck that felt hand-delivered by WotC directly to players. For Arcbound Ravagers, Arcbound Workers, Disciples of the Vault, and Thoughtcasts. For Frogmites, Mirror Enforcers, Shrapnel Blasts, and Cranial Platings. For Electrostatic Bolts. For Glimmer Voids, Seats of the Synod, Vaults of Whispers, and Great Furnaces. 4 Blink Moth Nexuses, and 4 Darksteel Citadels. That's all. Were people pissed that Kamigawa block did nothing to stop Affinity's onslaught on Standard? You betcha. People quit in droves, but I don't think it was because of any real failing on Champions of Kamigawa's part. Sure, the cards were, overall, worse on rate than the majority of their Mirrodin block counterparts, but Mirrodin block is a messed up group of Magic cards. It's funny that people brought up Kamigawa block in the comments of a video about Mercadian Masks block because the two blocks are kind of similar. They both follow blocks that had, shall we say, development issues. They're both low powered. But this for me is where the similarities end because the stuff in Kamigawa block is actually compelling to do. Commander is basically Kamigawa block the format. If you had to answer which format most closely approximates the platonic ideal of Commander gameplay, but in a competitive setting, you'd be hard-pressed to find a better approximation than Kamigawa block constructed. You had ramp, you had engines, and you had big, beefy haymaker cards that pulverized people immediately. It was awesome. Betrayers of Kamigawa was the second set in the block, and while there weren't a ton of playable cards in the set, there was one that made lots of waves. Umezawa's Jitte. There's a lot of text on Umezawa's Jitte. Players were pretty concerned about it, but the card ended up being just fine, if only because most creatures weren't really compelling enough to play. Jitte wasn't another busted equipment, it was an incentive to play creatures. It was a good thing. Unfortunately, Umezawa's Jitte was the only good card in the set. And yes, before you tell me that Goryo's Vengeance was in Betrayers 2, let me remind you that Grizzlebrand wasn't a thing yet. Neither were the Eldrazi. Even without Affinity, Betrayer Standard still wasn't really an environment where efficient creature combat was very good. So even though Jitte was objectively the best card in Betrayers, it saw basically no play along with the rest of the cards in the set. Players panned it. Here's why that was real dumb. The best cards in Mirrored and Block incentivized linear things, like another dubious artifact theme block to follow that would also get a ton of cards banned. Mirrored and cards were all about setting up whatever thing it was your deck did and not really interacting with your opponent. Blocks like this are hard to pull off successfully because they typically don't play well with other sets. We saw this with Temur Energy earlier this year. Only Kaladesh and Aether Revolt cards made energy, so outside of Glorybringer and the Scarab God, what else could you really play in an energy deck that wasn't in Kaladesh block? What I'm getting at here is that the 3 Mirrored and Block sets were frigging stupid, and the latter 2 Kamigawa sets got all the credit for pushing players out of the game. The Kamigawa sets were underpowered, but not so much that it would make people quit the game by itself. People dropped off around Betrayers, so the narrative is that they quit because of Betrayers, when in reality they quit because they were sick of Affinity, and the deck was finally banned way too late. For all the efforts WotC took to hide their flagship format from a wide audience, Standard was still the format that the majority of players played on a weekly basis. And Mirrored and Block cards made it unplayable, while Kamigawa block cards stood by helpless to do anything about it. It's frustrating because there's cool stuff going on in Champions and Betrayers. Example, I love Ninjutsu but assumed no one else even knew what it was. Then we got Yuriko as our Commander 2018 preview card, and people went nuts! As they should have! Ninjutsu is a sweet mechanic that plays particularly well in Limited, but currently sees lots of action in Pauper. And it's a pretty flavorful interpretation of the kind of thing a ninja would do in Magic. Just because Kamigawa block didn't work with Mirrored and Block doesn't mean it didn't work. Most people's evaluations of standard formats suffer from some substantial recency bias. Example, Innistrad RTR Standard was not as good as you remember it. Do you like Thragtusk decks winning via mill? How about putting a bunch of auras on a cheap hexproof creature? Or maybe you prefer a mindless, cast the most expensive card in my hand until the game is over Primeval Titan deck. It is straight up revisionist history to call Innistrad RTR Standard good. Same with Theros Con Standard. Any standard format with Thoughtseize is pretty much exempt from being any good. Don't even get me started on the argument that M11 and M12 were better core sets than the rest. Unless you enjoy being dead money because you didn't play Callblade or Delver, then don't say those sets were good for Magic. I say all of this because the real best standard of all time is Kamigawa Ravnica Standard, and while I'm not saying that quitting Magic during Affinity's Reign of Terror wasn't justified, it also all but ensured that you missed the best friggin' standard ever. Magic briefly flirted with 2-set blocks because for whatever reason, third sets always seem to fall flat. For every compelling third set, there are 3 or 4 third sets that are just really bad. Saviors of Kamigawa, the third set in the Kamigawa block, is right up there. Or down there, I suppose, with Homelands and Prophecy as one of the worst sets ever printed. Like, actively bad for stores to purchase sealed product bad. At least casuals bought Prophecy for the avatars and winds and spell shapers and whatever. Saviors of Kamigawa simply had nothing going for it at all. When the most expensive card in the set is Pithing Needle at $20, that's not great. A lack of compelling rares wasn't the only issue with Saviors of Kamigawa. Saviors also took a really good limited environment and dunked it in the toilet. Unlike older sets, Savior's mechanics weren't internally competitive. Sweep works well with the Hand Size Matters cards. Unfortunately, the Hand Size Matters cards encourage both players to cease playing Magic altogether. Here's how a game against Descendant of Kiyomero played out. Your opponent cast the Descendant, and now you literally can't do anything unless you want their creature to be a 3/5 for 3. Typically, you beat your opponent's cards by, doing things. But doing things, i.e., playing cards from your hand, doesn't work against a card that gets even better when its controller has the most cards in hand. Barring non-conditional removal, a game with a Descendant usually heralded an immediate halt in game actions, including land drops. Eventually, the defending player would pass the turn with 7 cards in hand, and the Descendant player would draw up to their 8th card, attack with more cards in hand, and then play a land and pass. It was exactly as horrendous as it sounds. Saviors and Betrayers ended up being nearly non-factors in Standard. Between both sets, a single-digit amount of cards were truly playable. That is my only gripe with the block and probably the best argument against it. 2 sets in a row like that, sets that are basically incapable of getting players to buy sealed product, could literally put an LGS out of business now. But once Ravnica hit and pushed the Mirrodin nonsense out of Standard, oh man, it was the best Standard ever. But maybe you disagree. What do you think was the best Standard ever? Let us know in the comments, and as always, if you don't like and subscribe, I can't be held responsible for what I might do. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time.